Mandatory wearing of face masks could be scrapped as early as next week.
Yes, Anne, certainly that's something that NPHET is considering in their first meeting in what has been a number of weeks now. This is possibly one of the last restrictions to remain in place during this COVID-19 pandemic, but perhaps moving from what will be a mandatory to a voluntary model. Now, there will be obviously some settings that perhaps there will be a mandatory requirement, for example, in healthcare settings, particularly at this time when we know that hospitals up and down the country are dealing with what's been described as a winter delay in terms of overcrowding. Also under consideration is the idea of removing the mandatory wearing of masks in schools. Speaking to one union in the last couple of moments saying they have no position on it as of yet, and they're waiting to see how the advice from NPHET will play out over this afternoon and into this evening. But as I mentioned there, hospitals are still very, very busy, and the reality, of course, that they're now seeing patients presenting who perhaps avoided going to hospital over the last year or two, particularly those aged over 75 now coming through, and they're coming in a lot sicker and staying for a lot longer. We were speaking this morning to one emergency department consultant, Dr. John Cronin. He's based at St Vincent's University Hospital in Dublin, and he's saying, look, they're very, very busy. It's not directly linked to COVID-19, but COVID is still having a massive knock-on effect, because you have to remember that even if a patient comes through and COVID's not the primary reason they've come into the hospital, they still have to be managed in isolation, and that takes up a lot of resources and a lot of space. Let's take a listen to what he had to say.
We're seeing patients coming in with being admitted to hospitals with completely other things other than COVID, but who are incidentally testing positive for COVID, which then places a strain on our bed management teams and the hospital in terms of finding appropriate inpatient beds for those patients to try and stop any kind of nosocomial or spread around the hospital itself.
Well, Anne, in the last hour, the Green Party leader, Eamon Ryan, has said that the government will await NPHET's advice on those face masks. But Eamon Ryan speaking about the fact that he would personally like to see those requirements lifted in school as soon as possible, and for masks in retail and transport to be made advisory, but not mandatory. As I say, we should have an update on that later this evening.